Hello fellow developers, welcome back to the channel where we explore hands-on software development projects. Today we are diving into a comprehensive contact management system built using Spring Boot. This project is perfect for sharpening backend skills and learning how to handle CRUD operations effectively. So let's get started. We will begin by examining the architecture of this application. We start with client requests, which consists of HTTP requests such as get, post, put, and delete. The double-headed arrow line stands for bidirectional requests. That is, requests are sent and then received. Next is the REST contact controller, which serves as the entry point of requests to your application. It receives requests and sends them to the contact service layer for the business logic to be handled. The contact service layer also sends requests to the repository layer for data. The contact repository queries the database for data stored in it. The database then sends the data to the contact repository. From there, the repository also sends it back to the service layer, which handles the business logic and then returns it to the controller to handle the requests. And then finally, controller sends a response back to the client. So this is what we will be doing today. First, ensure you have Java and MySQL installed. We also use the IntelliJ IDE. Now let's create our project from the Spring Initializer website. To do that, open your browser and go to start.spring.io. Fill in the project details to continue. And select Maven for the project, Java for the language, for Spring Boot, the latest stable version, which will be 3.4.1. For the project metadata, let's change this to com.gustav.ofosu. The architecture to contact manager, and you see the name has also been updated automatically. Let's change the description to contact manager project for Spring Boot. Then we have the package name. Now for packaging, we go with jar and Java version 21. Now let's add some dependencies. The first dependency we want is Spring Web. Add by clicking or pressing enter. Next is Spring Data JPA. Add. Next, Spring Boot Dev Tools. Add. Next, MySQL driver. Add. And finally, Lombok. Now click on Generate to download the zipped file. Select the location you want it and then click Save. Voila, downloaded. Open the folder and then extract it here. So there we have it. Now over to our IDE to open it. Let's open IntelliJ. Now we could have created our project here by clicking New Project and then selecting Spring Boot and entering the project details as we did on the web. We have already done that, so let's cancel and now click on Open. Locate where we saved our project, double click or select it and click OK to open. Yes, trust project. Let's wait for it to finish setting up and then continue. And done. Let's explore our project directory. We have the .idea, .maven, and src directories, which contain the project's main directory, resource directory, and other libraries. Let's look at the pom.xml file and the dependencies we selected. JPA, Web, DevTools, MySQL driver, Lombok, and an automatic test dependency. Okay, let's close it and now open the application.properties file from the resource directory. Here we will define some key configurations that will enable our application to run successfully. We already have our application name as the contact manager. Now let's add the following. Database configuration. Spring.datasource.url equals jdbc mysql localhost 3306 slash contact manager. Spring.datasource.username equals root. Spring.datasource.password equals admin. And spring.jpa.hibernate.ddl-auto equals update. The username and password is the username and password for your database. Then the Hibernate login. Spring.jpa.show.sql equals true. And spring.jpa.properties.hibernate.format_SQL equals true. We can also define the port. So server configuration, then server.port equals 8080. You can leave this out since the server's default port is always 8080. You can give it a different number. Now we need to create the contact-manager database. So we open the terminal for MySQL and then we type this: create database contact-manager. Press enter. Now to check if this worked, we type show databases, press enter, and as you can see, our contact database was successfully created. Now let's go back to our IDE. Now we open the contact manager application file. This contains the main method for the application. So we run the application by clicking on the play button. Since there are no errors, that means our application ran successfully. Also, we can see it says Tomcat started on port 8080. Now that we are certain it works, let's get back to coding. Our project follows the standard Spring Boot structure. That is a repository, service, controller, and model layers. So let's create the packages. You right click on the main package, we go to new, and then we click package. Now let's name our first package repository and press enter. Next is service. Then controller. And finally the model. Now let's create our model entity. To do this, we right click on the model package, we go to new, then we click Java class. Let's name it contact. Okay, let's define some fields we want our entity class to have. First is private long ID, private string name, private string email, private string phone, private string address, private local date, birthday, private string occupation, private string tags, private string notes, private local date created at, private local date updated at. Now for it to become a database entity, we annotate it with @entity. We also need the getters and setters and constructors. So we annotate it with @data from Lombok. Let's take a look at this @data annotation. As you can see, it says it generates getters for all fields. We also generate setters for all non-final fields as well as a constructor. So our @data will provide all this for us. Okay, let's go back. Now we have defined our entity table and now we need the ID. So let's annotate our ID with @ID annotation from Jakarta. And then at generated value, then the strategy is generation type dot identity. So this will define our ID field as the primary key. Now our entity class is complete. Next, let's create our repository. Our repository will be an interface. So we select interface and then we name it contact repository and then enter. Now this repository will extend the JPA repository to inherit the use of its data manipulation methods. Now the JPA repository takes our model class contact and the data type of its ID as parameters. Moving on, we create our service class. Let's name our class contact service. Now let's annotate it with @service. So Spring can recognize it as a service class. Let's define our fields. So this takes the private contact repository. Now let's import the class. Okay, let's define a method to create a contact. So public contact create contact and it takes a contact parameter. Now let's return contact repository.save contact. Our next method is to retrieve all contacts. So public list takes contacts as a parameter. We accept the input and then get all contacts. Then we return contact repository dot find all. Next, the method to retrieve a single contact by its ID. So public optional takes contacts and then get contact by ID. And it takes an ID as its parameter. Now we return contact repository dot find by ID. Our next method is to update an existing contact. So public contact update contact and it takes an ID and contact as a parameter. Then it returns contact repository dot find by ID, then dot map, then contact arrow function, then contact dot set name, contact to update dot get name. So we copy this and then we change them to match the fields. Okay. And finally, we return contact repository dot save contact. Then outside this parenthesis dot or else throw a lambda function new runtime exception with the message contact with ID not found. Our next method is to delete a contact. So we type public void delete contact and takes an ID as parameter. Now this should be public. We continue. If not contact repository dot exist by ID throw new runtime exception, and then you can just copy this contact with ID not found, and then contact repository dot delete by ID. So now our business logic class has finally been completed. Now to our controller class. Let's name our controller contact controller and then press enter. Here we define our HTTP request methods. And before we continue, there is one thing we forgot to add to our service class. We have to inject our repository field. So let's add the at required acts constructor annotation to do so. Now back to our controller class. Let's add some annotations. First, we add the at required acts constructor, and then the controller annotation. Now there is the normal controller and then the rest controller annotation. We will use the at rest controller annotation because we are creating REST APIs. Now we need to inject our service class. So let's define the field. Private final contact service. We accept the import. Okay, now let's define our methods. Our first method is creating a contact. So we define public response entity. Now, response entity is the class that represents the entire HTTP response, including the status code, headers, and then the body. Okay, let's continue. The response entity returns a contact. Then we name it create contact, and it takes a contact object as a parameter. Now, because we want our parameter to be bounded by the body of the HTTP request, we add the annotation at request body before the contact. Now let's return response entity.ok contact service dot create contact as we call the create contact from the service class. Now response entity.ok is a method used to create a response with an HTTP status code of 200 along with the response body. It indicates a request was successfully processed. Before we continue, let's add annotation here. At request mapping, then /API/contacts. This is used at the class level to set a base path for all methods in the contact controller. Okay, so we have our method done, but it is incomplete. We need to tell Spring Boot that this method is a post request method. So we annotate it with at post mapping. Next, let's get all our contacts. So we define public response entity, and it takes a list of contacts. Then we name it get all contacts. Then we return response entity dot OK, and then the contact service dot get all contacts. This is a get request method, so let's annotate it with at get mapping. Let's continue with the get contact by ID method. So we type public response entity takes a contact, and then get contact by ID, and it takes an ID as a parameter. Now, since we want our ID to be bounded to the path, we add an annotation at path variable. Then it returns contact service dot get contact by ID, then dot map response entity double colons OK dot or else response entity dot not found dot build. Now let's add a method level annotation at get mapping. Then we also include the ID. So annotation slash parenthesis ID. Next, let's write our update contact method. So we define public response entity takes contact, then update contact. Now this takes an ID and then the contact object as a parameter. Now we add the at path variable for the ID parameter, and then at request body for the contact parameter in the method body. So let's do this. In the method body, let's do this. We try and return response entity dot OK contact service dot update contact, then ID comma updated contact. Then we catch the exception, so runtime exception. Then it returns response entity dot not found dot build. Now, since this is an update method, we annotate this method with at put mapping, and then we add the ID parameter. Our final method, which is the delete method. So we type public response entity void. Now, because it returns nothing, then we go to delete contact, and it takes an ID parameter. So we use a try and catch as well. So try contact service dot delete contact ID, and returns response entity dot no content, then dot build. And it catches a runtime exception. So return response entity dot found dot not found dot build. Then we add the annotation at delete mapping, then parenthesis slash ID to indicate a delete request. Okay. So our application is finally complete, and all that's left is to test the application. So let's run the application. Now we enable annotation processing. Okay, looks like we have an error. This says variable contact service not initializing the default constructor. Okay, so this is happening because the application is unable to access the Lombok annotations. Now to fix this, we go to File, then we click on Settings, then we click on Build, Execution and Deployment. then go to compiler, and then click on annotation processes. Now by default, the annotation processor is set to the default processor path as we see. We need to change that to obtain the processes from the project class path. So we click on contact manager, and then we select obtain processes from project class path, and we click apply to apply the changes, and then click OK to exit. Now that should fix our error. Let's rerun our application. And as you can see, all the errors are gone. Now we can also see here that Hibernate has created our contact table for us successfully. Now we are going to test our application to see if it works. For that, we will use an API testing software called Postman. You can check out this video showing in the upper right corner on how to use Postman. Alright, so let's open the Postman application. So this is the Postman interface. When you click here, you can see the various available HTTP requests from the get to the options request. Alright, let's start with our first HTTP request, which is a post request. So we select post from the drop down menu, and then we enter the URL http localhost 8080/API/contact. Now go to the body tab. We change this from the text to the JSON, then enter in our JSON data. We open curly brackets, the name, email, phone, address, birthday, occupation, tax, notes. Now we click on send to send the request. Alright, we have an error. So let's see what it says. It says no static resource. Okay, our URL is supposed to be contacts, not contact. So we change that and then we click on send. We have another error, and it says cannot invoke contact repository.save because this contact repository is null. So let's go back to our IDE. Now in the service class, it looks like our repository field was not injected into our service class. So let's replace the required acts constructor with all acts constructor. This should work. Now let's go back to Postman and then try again. We click on send, and finally it worked. We have our request saved, and we can see a 200 OK for successful requests. Let's add a few more. Now let's test our get method to retrieve all data stored. So change from the post to the get method, and then using the same URL, we click on send, and we can see we have all our stored data in our database. Now the next is we test the get by ID method. So up here we add /2 because we want to access the contact with ID 2. Then we click send, and it returns contact with ID 2. We change it to 1, send, and then we change it to 3. I click send. Okay. Now next on our application. So first let's get all our contacts again. Now we want to update one of the contacts. So we change our request from get to put. We want to update contact with ID 1. So we type /1. And in our body, we make the following changes. Now we send the request and it returns our data with the changes saved. Let's check with the get method and we can see the update was successful. Our last and final method is the delete method. So we change the request to delete. Now let's delete contact with ID 2. So we add /2 to our URL and then we click send. Okay. This is blank because our method returns void. That is why we see 204 no content. Now when we try to get our contact with ID 2, we get a 404 not found alert. And then when we get all the contacts, we can see our contact of ID 2 is no more. So fellow developers, this is how to build a contact manager REST application. Now note, this is just the first part. In the second part, we will add a front end to our application. Now, please consider subscribing, give a thumbs up, and hit the notification icon for notifications. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.